Thanks, Adrian. Our next speaker is Ruthie BenDor, and we were talking, and how many of you ride your bike regularly, like maybe to work or something? Yeah, see? Well, Ruthie's better than all of you because she rode from Boston to San Francisco. So, just saying, right? So go ahead.
Testing. Ah, there we go. We're good. Microphone. Hello. The biking thing is actually surprisingly easy if you have 4 months to spare. So my name's Ruthie. Hello. Thanks for having me. I am not a technical writer. I'm an engineer. Someone let me in, so thanks for letting me hang out with you today. I've spent the last decade writing and documenting software at nonprofits, at for-profits, at trying to make profits. I've put in time at traditional companies, at consultancies, at investment-backed startups, even a stint in government technology, organizations working in all different sectors at different sizes, moving at different speeds. And I've spent a lot of time wrestling with the purpose of and processes around a particular kind of technical documentation. Not this kind. So if your company has at least one human dedicated to writing technical docs, for how many folks is that true? It's probably you. I'll bet you a donut from Blue Star, because they're better, that your company's business depends on the existence of external technical docs. So what are external technical docs? These are public-facing docs for things like your API, or how-to guides, or sample applications, or SDKs, or FAQs, or some other three-letter abbreviation. External docs are the materials that we produce to enable people outside of our organizations succeed at using the software that we make. But there's another kind of technical documentation that we haven't talked about a ton in the last day or two. And this kind exists at every company where software is written. No matter how big or small the organization, no matter how fast or slow they move. And I'm talking about internal technical docs. These are things like READMEs on closed source projects, things like uptime docs for PagerDuty, which, if you don't know what that is, it's checklists for how do I unbreak the thing that unexpectedly just broke. But it's also things like instructions for setting up the virtual environment for the engineer who started this morning, or rotating credentials, changing all your passwords when someone leaves. Internal docs are the materials that we produce for our colleagues and for our future selves as we build and build upon our work. And internal docs are what I'd like to talk about today. I'm going to share a couple of stories, and I'm going to suggest some strategies for getting internal docs written under less than ideal circumstances, and maybe reflect a bit about building documentation culture in places where software gets made. So first story. The first time I ever wrote technical documentation for a job, this was years and years ago, and it was at an organization that, from a technical perspective, moved very slowly. It was, and still is, a stable nonprofit. It's been around for, I think, 40 years at this point. They do great work. I was the only software engineer on staff. I spent 4 years there, and after that time, I felt that I had accomplished everything that I wanted to accomplish, and it was time to move on. When you're the only technical person at an organization, saying, "That's not my job," about anything technical is a non-starter. That just doesn't fly, because it's not like anyone else is going to do it. So I decided that it was my responsibility to ensure that the website and all of the related technical infrastructure, much of which I had a hand in building and certainly had a hand in maintaining, I wanted to make sure that all of that would keep humming along without me. So I spent my last 2 months there writing up a novel's worth of documentation on exactly how everything worked. I drew diagrams, I commented every piece of code that I could find, Like, I'm pretty sure there was more comments in the code than there was code. I wrote up how-tos for everything from how to put up a new blog post to how to make sure that we were PCI compliant because we accepted donations. And then like just random strange things like what that one weird Perl script does that was written by a volunteer in the mid-'80s and is actually really essential, so like don't delete it. So I spent 2 whole months on that. And honestly, by the time I left, I was a little worried that maybe I'd gone a bit overboard. But as time went on, it turned out that my instinctive everything in the kitchen sink approach to writing internal technical docs was exactly the right approach for this organization. Completely by accident, I had found the reason why this org cared about internal technical docs. And if they'd ever had to articulate it, it would probably look something like this. Next story. So fast forward a few years, and I found myself working at a digital agency. Has anyone here worked at an agency or at a dev shop, that sort of environment? Okay, so I'm seeing like 20% of the hands just went up. So culturally speaking, this is about as far from slow-moving nonprofit as you can get and still be writing software for the internet. At an agency, as a software engineer, you're generally not writing production software. Most of the time, you're making prototypes. And the code artifacts that you produce, they're all throwaway. They're meant to vet an idea or use in a pitch or a demo. But that's it. That's as far as it goes. You're not meant to be shipping actual supportable code. You're basically making the software equivalent of disposable shopping bags, because that's what the clients are paying for. They care about the contents. They care about what's in the bag. They don't care about the container that you made. So I didn't write too much internal documentation during my time there. I wrote the correct amount, which was the bare minimum that I needed to understand the thing that I was working on between now and next Tuesday when the deliverable was due. And that was it. The code bases needed to be understandable enough to run, but not understandable enough to maintain or extend. Why I had done things in a particular way didn't really matter. So if the average agency had to articulate the value that it places on internal technical documentation, it would look something like this. And I want to be really clear that this is not a criticism of that agency or of any agency or dev shop. This is a totally rational position for an agency or dev shop to take, given their business model. We're a room full of people who care about docs, so this may feel uncomfortable, and let's just sit with that for a moment. For me, actually, it was an exercise in humility to go from believing that I knew the right way to document things to just understanding that the right way, what the right way is contextual. But also, I feel like this conference is a safe space for me to share that I'm not the right kind of person to work at an agency over the long term. My happy place is shipping production software. I care about making things that people use and find meaningful, that I get to iterate on over time, that I get to learn from. And what better place to do that than at a product-driven startup that lives or dies by the product that we ship and how we iterate from it and how we iterate on it and how we learn from it. So this brings me to my third and last story. After the agency, I found a startup that fit the bill. Smart people making a cool, useful, meaningful, engineering-heavy product, and I hopped aboard. The day before I started, because I'm a nerd, I thought to myself, I can't wait to read their internal docs on what they've made so far, because this is what I think on Sundays. But did you catch my bad assumption? The assumption, in case you missed it, I said it pretty fast. It goes something like this. This is a fast-moving startup. Surely they won't want to lose time in onboarding me. So they'll have made that process really efficient. I had assumed, and so here's the bad assumption, I had assumed that the organization I was joining valued internal technical docs for my sake, which is maybe not the most humble of assumptions. And you can guess where this is going. On my first day, here is the wiki page for the code base that I was inheriting. Check 1, 2. Ah, there we go. Yes. Gremlins. So many READMEs look like this. And I started referring to these in my head, by the way, as why bother reading these. Turns out there's not a markdown format for that. I was hired as a front-end engineer, and I was the first pure front-end engineer at this company. It took me 3 working days to get the code powering the website to run on my laptop. Not to make changes to it, not to deploy anything, whatever, just to get the thing working on my local machine. So I started on a Monday, and I sent these emails to my boss Wednesday at like 6 p.m., I think. And it took another 2 working days to make my first code contribution. Again, I changed code. Doesn't mean that code was deployed, but I made a change, so that was a win. And it took this long because I ran into glitch after glitch trying to make the code review tools work for me, just trying to figure out how to make this system let me do my job. And during this week, I had to continually interrupt 2 other engineers, also my boss, and also, curiously, the person running data science at the company. Why data science? I'm working on a website. Because that person was also the one who set up a bunch of our code review tooling. That person is actually now my boss, and he's great, but like, this is an example of what happens at startups. So this bumpy start didn't smooth out for some time. The laughs that you hear are the engineers. A few weeks in, just to explain what this is about, a few weeks in, I managed to get a version-controlled code base that I was working on into such a bad state that it took 2 senior engineers a full hour to untangle it. One of those senior engineers, by the way, since then has actually written a Git client. And I had gotten previous jobs on the strength of my ability to teach Git, so I still to this day have no idea what happened there. Like, this is how it started. It got worse from here. Now, our internal technical docs today, this was all about 2 years ago when I started, and our internal technical docs today are much better than they were back then by any metric. A metric that I care most about is when we onboarded the most recent engineer to our team, they were able to commit and deploy code their first day, I think before lunch. And that's pretty magical. So I'm going to explain how we got there, and from that, maybe how you can get there too. So step 1, can't read the step 1, but it says step 1. If your organization's internal technical docs are in a bad state, the first thing we want to do is try and fix them. Don't do that. Instead, put on your sleuthing hat and figure out exactly what is broken. Don't guess, because what we see as broken might not be the same thing that the rest of the organization believes is broken. Make sure you're solving the right problem. So, in my case, the thing that I had originally perceived as broken was our build processes tooling. I thought that our technical infrastructure was broken. But when I looked more closely, I realized that actually, in terms of engineering best practices, we do a lot of things really, really well. Like, this is really rare for small startups, which is where I was working, where I do work. So I'd ruled out bad tools. And so my next fear was, oh no, maybe my new colleagues just hate me. Or if they don't hate me, maybe they're just irrationally biased against documentation. I mean, this is sort of the stereotype that engineers have. We just hate documentation, like READMEs kicked our dogs when we were children. Like, this is a stereotype, right? And of course, that's not true either. My colleagues actually were always supportive, 100% of the time, even when they had deadlines to meet and things to ship and things were blowing up and the server disappeared. They're always helpful, always willing to help me puzzle through something that was new to me and old hat to them. And crucially, this was the part that really made me realize that I was off base. They were always happy to improve or expand upon docs that either they'd written or I'd started to write. When I would point out omissions or confusing bits, I'd be like, I ran this, and I expected this to happen, but instead my computer caught fire. Why is that? And they'd be like, oh, because I don't even know. So those aren't the actions of people who hate you. Probably, I don't know. And they're definitely not the actions of people who won't write docs. These are the actions of people who'd happily write docs. So what was broken? And in the case of my organization, I learned that internal technical docs, they're seen as a dead artifact. They're seen as a rapidly depreciating asset. It's like you buy a new car, you drive it off the lot, it's just lost 10% of its value. That's how my teammates saw internal technical docs. As soon as you write it, it's obsolete. And even in a world of living style guides and self-generating docs, the truth is that having those things doesn't eliminate the work. It just tries to improve the ergonomics of it. There's no free lunch. Like living style guides, I've written a couple of them, they occasionally need transfusions, to extend the metaphor. And engineers are usually the ones who feel the pain of setting up these self-perpetuating, all-thinking, all-knowing systems in the first place. And so they know what happens when the self-perpetuating system doesn't quite get it right. So understand that when engineers are resistant to this sort of thing, it's coming from a rational place. They're the ones who have to deal with the situation when your self-generating docs break. There were a couple other problems, too. Before I and others were hired, the engineering team was so small that everyone was coming from the same background in terms of programming language. I was the first pure front-end hire. Everyone else was back-end folks. I sit next to a guy who wrote the book on Python, or a book on Python. And so my showing up broke this assumption. The fact that I was sitting there was when this broke, what caused this to break. The other thing about joining a pretty early stage company is that the quantity of software that existed prior to my showing up was actually pretty small. There weren't that many code bases, there wasn't that much. And if you'd been there for any length of time, you probably had the institutional knowledge that you needed in order to be productive. New folks like me, not so much. So again, these were assumptions, presumptions that worked fine until the world changed. And there was one final thing that I uncovered, and I wanted to mention this one because this is something that's totally in everybody's control to fix. There was no clear directive from either the top nor any sort of unanimous agreement from the bottom as to where internal docs should live. Here are places where internal docs live: wikis, post-its, emails, readmes, whiteboards, photographs of whiteboards that are in someone else's email. If you haven't defined a place where these things live, then they're going to live wherever is most expedient for the person who is producing it in that moment, and this way lies madness. First quick bite-sized takeaway is pick a place where docs live. Doesn't matter what that place is. You can optimize once you've decided what that place is, but honestly, it doesn't matter what place you pick, just pick one. And make sure that everyone uses that thing and not emailed photographs of whiteboards that have been erased. So that was where we start. That was where we started. Our technology wasn't broken, it turned out, and our people weren't broken. There was nothing wrong with them. They were fantastic. They are fantastic. The problem was assumptions and process that hadn't kept up with the changing needs of the organization. Something to think about at fast-moving organizations. So now we know what we're trying to fix, which is great. That means we can start fixing it, right? No. Ain't gonna work, because we skipped a step. You have to, before you can start fixing things, you have to figure out why your organization and the people in it care about internal technical docs. We've seen a few examples of different organizations caring for different reasons so far. So that slow-moving nonprofit, it cared about internal technical docs because it valued longevity. If this is what your startup values, I will eat my hat. Also, your startup's probably not in business anymore. But in terms of the startup that I work at, like, my initial assumption about that was also flat wrong. It's perfectly valid for an for an organization to care about internal technical docs because they help onboard new staff. But that's not the reason why they exist. That's not what's going to motivate people to produce them. The only exception to this would be if you're like a presidential campaign and you're onboarding an entire new desk of people or new row of desks every week, then maybe this would be the overriding reason. But for most organizations, you're not really focusing on that. You're focusing on the product that you're making. You don't have the luxury yet of having someone dedicated to your internal processes. You're just not there yet. My second assumption, by the way, turned out to be wrong too. I'm wrong a lot, it's fine. Your bus factor, who knows what bus factor means? Who doesn't know what bus factor means? Great. So, bus factor is one of my favorite phrases, and it's the number of people who can be unexpectedly lost from a project before the project collapses. So the lower the number, the more screwed you are when those individuals get hit by metaphorical or literal buses. So that's bus factor. And a perfectly valid reason to write technical docs is, say all of your, another way of referring to this is how siloed is your information, how much of your institutional knowledge is locked into your founding engineer's head, or like 2 or 3 people's heads. I'm getting a few nods right now. Like there's one great reason to write internal technical docs is to make it so that when your founding engineer leaves, you still know how to keep the lights on. The thing about bus factor, though, is that this is also not the reason why your startup is going to care about writing internal technical docs. Because if you could predict, buses, in the context of startups, this is something like layoffs. If you could predict those, you're not going to be writing internal technical docs. You're going to be polishing your resume. So if I was going to be successful in this role at this startup, I needed to figure out why this organization and the people in it care about internal technical documentation. So I started talking to engineers, to the team that I was working with, that I am working with. And while they were helping me get my local environment set up, patiently walking me through all of the Unix commands that I had misremembered, I would casually ask what they were working on and how it interacted with other parts of our product, and how they all worked together. And what I realized, and this is true for my organization, it may not be true for yours, but I'm sure it's true for many out there. At my organization, what we value is learning from each other. That's the thing that gets us up in the morning. That's why we come to work together each day. And this is actually a really delightful realization. I know a key thing about my company now. I can describe its culture. And as a special bonus for me, I know that my and my team's values align. And this is a really important place to start from if you're trying to fix something that's broken, because if you have the same values, then you can start working together as a team and figure out how to move forward together. So, figure out why your organization cares about fixing its internal docs. One last point on that, actually, because I think it's really worth mentioning. Your engineering organization's approach to internal technical documentation is actually a really good proxy for your engineering organization's culture, understanding its culture. So what you document and how you document it, those are expressions of your company values. And I'm not talking about the values that are like on the posters on the wall. I'm talking about the actual values. So you can, as we move on, think about, what does the answer to this question tell you about your company culture? Now we know what needs fixing, and now we know what will motivate our teams to actually fix it. So we now have the tools that we need in order to build solutions that stick. This is the fun part. Because what you get to do is design solutions. This is hacking in sort of the best original sense of it, where you're figuring out how to get the results that you want with the materials that you have in possibly non-traditional ways. And what the correct answer is for how to do this is going to be completely different depending on what type of organization you work at. If your organization values longevity, like that nonprofit, maybe white papers are a good solution for your internal docs, or maybe like professionally produced videos that get updated once every 2 years, or like NASA-style training manuals, perhaps, or like Tolstoy-level docs, which is what I ended up doing. If your organization values learning from each other, maybe weekly show and tells are a good solution. There's a fun hack for that too, which is if you're doing a weekly show and tell, the person doing the show and tell has to have spent no time with the code base ahead of time. So that's a really great way to incentivize good docs and to check that docs that exist, internal docs that exist, are actually correct. So there's ways that you can play with it. And I'd love to talk to folks afterwards about what your organization values and maybe what approaches might make sense. But it's not going to be one size fits all. Something to think about. And there's one last step. This one's pretty specific to fast-moving organizations, but it's true to some degree, I would say, for basically any organization that's changing over time, which is to say, any organization. At every inflection point of the company, of the organization, reevaluate your values. Make sure that they still make sense for what you're trying to do this quarter, this year, this decade. This talk's title, Move Fast and Document Things, is a nod to Facebook's old motto that they used to have, which was move fast and break things. That was their motto from when they were founded through 2014. And in 2014, they publicly announced at their annual conference that their motto was no longer move fast and break things. They had some replacement motto that I don't actually know what it was. It wasn't particularly memorable. But the point is they were no longer moving fast and breaking things. That was no longer the ethos. They'd reached a size and scale and level of complexity where a different trade-off between speed and quality, for which I would say internal docs are a good proxy, was appropriate. So fast-moving organizations, like startups, will have moments like this too. When I joined my company, that was one of those inflection points. We've had a couple more since then. Your organization's probably had a bunch, and it's going to have more. So will we recognize them? When we do, how will we adapt? Thank you very much. Awesome.